birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Welcome to Cineversary, a podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a masterful work of cinema. Every month, we extend happy birthday wishes to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee. We count that as anything from a 20th all the way up to a 100th anniversary. This, as ever, is your devoted host, Eric Martin, creator of the Cineverse blog and moderator of the weekly Cineverse film discussion group. If you've just discovered us, hey, plenty of room, come on in. Repeat champions, we've saved you a spot. In 1955, a film emerged that seemed to defy categorization. Was it a horror movie? Should they call it a folksy fairy tale? Did it belong in the film noir canon? What would they think of the picture's implicit and explicit violence toward children and women? And for that matter, what would religious moviegoers or theater attendees in rural areas make of it, especially when it seemed to criticize these people? It certainly coughed up some controversy, although not nearly enough box office back then. But 70 years later, we're still talking about it, and for good reason. It continues to be regarded as an all-time masterwork. That film, of course, is The Night of the Hunter, originally released on July 26, 1955. In this installment, I'll be joined by Imogen Smith, author of In Lonely Places, Film Noir Beyond the City, editor-in-chief of Noir City magazine, and frequent contributor to the Criterion Collection. Together, we'll travel on horseback and skiff boat in your imagination to explore what makes this movie a masterpiece, the filmmakers it inspired, key thematic takeaways, and much, much more. But before we get to the meal, you've got to set the table, right? So let's take a moment and soak in all the details about how this work came to be. The Night of the Hunter is a 1955 American thriller directed by Charles Laughton, starring Robert Mitchum, Shelley Winters, and Lillian Gish. Adapted from Davis Grubb's 1953 novel, the screenplay was penned by James Agee. The story follows Harry Powell, played by Mitchum, a menacing serial killer masquerading as a preacher who hunts a young boy and a little girl in pursuit of $10,000 hidden in the little girl's doll. Both the novel and film were inspired by the real-life crimes of Harry Powers, who was executed in 1932 for the murder of multiple victims in Clarksburg, West Virginia. Laughton's film is notable for its lyrical, dreamlike quality and expressionistic visual style, heavily influenced by the techniques of silent cinema. The project took shape when literary agent Harold Matson sent Grubb's novel to producer Paul Gregory, who then passed it along to Laughton. Enchanted by its dark fairy tale atmosphere, Laughton referred to it as a nightmarish Mother Goose story and traveled to meet Grubb in Philadelphia, where the two exchanged ideas for several days. Grubb, who had a background in art, contributed sketches that would later inspire the film's storyboards. Although initially considered to adapt his own book, Grubb was ultimately passed over in favor of a professional screenwriter. James Agee, selected for his Southern roots and familiarity with Depression-era narratives, began work on the script in April 1954. His initial draft, however, was nearly 300 pages long. Laughton extensively revised it for shooting, although he insisted Agee retain sole credit. Navigating production code restrictions proved pretty challenging, particularly given concerns over portraying a preacher as a villain. Gregory worked closely with the production code administration to address objections, adjusting the script so Powell would not appear to represent an actual clergyman. Protestant groups, nonetheless, voiced disapproval. For visual inspiration, the director screened original nitrate prints of silent classics like The Birth of a Nation, Intolerance, and The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. He aimed to recapture the emotional intensity of silent film within a modern sound picture. Night of the Hunter's budget came in just under $600,000, including $75,000 for the rights to Grubb's novel. Although Laughton briefly considered playing Harry Powell himself, Gregory persuaded him to cast a marquee star. While actors like Gary Cooper, John Carradine, and Laurence Olivier were considered, Robert Mitchum ultimately landed the part, winning Laughton over with his dark charisma and audacious audition. Shelley Winters secured the role of Willa Harper shortly before production began, chosen for her vulnerability and depth rather than celebrity status. Lawton's first choice for Rachel Cooper was his own wife, Elsa Lanchester, but when she declined, Lillian Gish was suggested. Lawton, initially hesitant, was won over after viewing Gish's early work with D.W. Griffith, drawn to her silent-era gravitas. Principal photography took place over 36 days from August to October 1954, with sets built on sound stages and ranches in California rather than the Appalachian locations originally proposed to Mitchum. To streamline the shoot, Lawton avoided conventional takes, often letting the camera run uninterrupted for an entire reel. This technique recalled the continuous action of silent film production. Director of photography Stanley Cortez, who had previously worked with Orson Welles, collaborated closely with Lawton, who was relatively inexperienced in film technique. Together they devised a striking visual palette using sharp contrasts and expressionistic compositions. Cortez employed Kodak's new Tri-X film stock for certain scenes to achieve the sharp, high-contrast look Lawton admired in nitrate prints. The studio initially pushed for color, believing it would boost ticket sales, but Gregory successfully argued that black and white was essential for the film's stark, fable-like quality. Hilliard Brown's art direction echoed the angular, nightmarish aesthetics of 1920s German Expressionism, with deliberately minimal, abstract set designs reflecting a child's selective perception. The score, by Walter Schumann, blended nostalgic melodies with eerie, atmospheric passages crafted in tandem with Lawton's vision. Upon its July 26, 1955 premiere in Des Moines, Iowa, The Night of the Hunter was met with poor reviews and dismal box office returns. Disheartened, Lawton never again directed another film. Yet, over time, critics and audiences reevaluated the picture and have hailed it as a cinematic masterpiece. In 1992, Night of the Hunter was inducted into the United States National Film Registry. French film journal Cahiers du Cinéma ranked it second only to Citizen Kane in 2008. Empire magazine listed it among the 500 greatest movies ever made. And in the Sight and Sound poll, it climbed from number 63 in the 2012 poll to number 25 in 2022. The American Film Institute has also honored the movie's impact, ranking it number 34 on its 100 Years, 100 Thrills list, and naming Harry Powell the 29th greatest movie villain of all time. Today, The Night of the Hunter holds a 93% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, with an average critical score of 9.1 out of 10, and an exceptional Metacritic score of 97, confirming its status as one of the cinema's most haunting and original works. Feast your ears now on the original theatrical trailer to The Night of the Hunter.
Ben never told you threw it in the river, did he?
I can hear you whispering, children, so I know you're down there. I can feel myself getting awful mad.
Here is all the passion and suspense, the heart-pounding warmth of the best-selling novel that gripped millions.
Burl, wake up! Come on, Burl!
Superb, unforgettable performances by an extraordinary array of talent.
Figured I was gone, huh?
Run, hide in the staircase. Run quick! Ruby, shit! What do you want?
I want them kids.
I'm giving you to the count of 3 to get out of here, then I'm coming across the kitchen shooting you.
The combined powers of Paul Gregory and Charles Lawton brought the Caine Mutiny Court-Martial to Broadway. Now the screen receives that same creative, electrifying impact. The Night of the Hunter.
All right, my guest and I will be traversing through Plotland in our discussion ahead, so if you've never laid eyes on this movie, now's your chance to quickly detour to your preferred screen and catch up to The Night of the Hunter. And it's actually available for free right now on YouTube, so no excuses. Doing otherwise, it could incur the wrath of a Mr. Harry Powell, and nobody wants that.
That makes me mad. Makes me very, very mad.
A round of applause now for our guest this month, Imogen Sarah Smith. Now, she's the author of the books In Lonely Places, Film Noir Beyond the City, as well as Buster Keaton, The Persistence of Comedy. She also serves as the editor-in-chief of Noir City magazine. Her writing has appeared in Film Comment, Sight and Sound, Cineast, and Reversed Shot. And her essays, audio commentaries, and interview supplements, they can often be found in many Criterion Collection Blu-rays and DVDs. Imogen, a big hearty welcome to Cineversary.
Thank you for having me.
Such a pleasure. Again, you've long been on my radar, and I've been keeping track of your work in print, online, and videos, on Criterion discs, and so forth. It's a real treat to be able to talk to you today. So, Night of the Hunter, what a movie. 70 years. How far back do you go with this film? Do you recall when and where you first watched it, and maybe what impression it had on you initially?
Well, I encountered it first in what I think is the best way to encounter it, which was as a child. I don't remember exactly how old I was. I want to say I think I was around the age perhaps that John is
Wow.
in the movie, but my parents showed it to me. And what I remember most about that was how much Robert Mitchum terrified me
I'll bet.
with his performance as Preacher Harry Powell. And I loved the movie nonetheless, and I've seen it many, many times over the years, and I see so much more in it now, and I see how funny it is, and I appreciate a lot about the artistry of the movie. But I feel like I can still kind of connect with that frisson of terror that is in this film, which I think is, to a modern audience, this may not seem like a scary movie, but I think there is a real thread of horror that goes through it, and it is a child's fear.
Yeah.
And so I'm grateful that I had the experience of watching it as a child.
That's fantastic recall on your part, because what a blessing in a way, but it could be a curse depending on how scarred you were from the experience.
I don't think I was scarred.
Okay, well, that's good.
By the way, Robert Mitchum is now, among my very favorite actors. So certainly did not traumatize me too much.
Good. I mean, we can all relate. We probably, I can't speak for you, but so many of my generation at least have watched, let's say, The Wizard of Oz at age 3 or 4 first time, and of course have long-lasting trauma from The Wicked Witch of the West or something like that. So to see films like this, classic movies that may not be considered as terrifying today, nevertheless, you were young and impressionable and perfect age to relate to characters like John and Pearl. That's a special experience, and hopefully it translated into a lifelong love for this movie, which it sounds like it did.
It did, absolutely.
How do you categorize Night of the Hunter? And, with this question I'm asking, is it primarily a thriller in your eyes? Is it an expressionistic horror film? Do you regard it as a fairy tale fantasy? Is it a Southern Gothic, a film noir, or is it something else?
Well, of course, what is special about this movie is that it is kind of all of the above. And I think the one thing that you maybe left out is it's also very funny. There is also a strong element of comedy in the film.
I'm giving you to the count of 3 to get out of here, then I'm coming across the kitchen shooting you.
I do think of this as a uncharacterizable film. It's very, very much of a genre hybrid, but I suppose to me, the heart of it is kind of the Southern Gothic and the fairy tale aspects of it, the atmosphere, this sort of vision of America that it captures. But it is certainly also an expressionistic horror film and a sort of fable and, a lot of other things. But it's hard to think of another film that combines so many different tones and elements.
So true, isn't it? Like, it's amazing. It's really hard to put on a particular shelf in the old video store kind of analogy. You can regard this picture as a chase film or a coming-of-age movie or a religious allegory, for that matter.
And and it's a kind of lyrical film about, rural America during the Depression as well.
Mm-hmm. Early on, Pauline Kael calls it one of the most frightening movies ever made. Roger Ebert kind of echoes those thoughts. To your point, Criterion Collection essayist Terence Rafferty said that despite its macabre iconography and chilling unease, this is maybe the most radical aspect of The Night of the Hunter, which is its humorous tone and its least appreciated virtue, its sense of humor. He says that more conventional horror movies overdo the solemnity of evil. The monster in The Night of the Hunter is so bad, he's funny. Lawton and Mitchum treat evil with the indignity it deserves.
Yes.
There's another essayist here. His name is Matt Major. He said that deeply embedded into this film, the viewer finds the cabinet of Dr. Caligari's graphic bucolic sets, the biblical Southern Gothic epic as perfected by D.W. Griffith, the family film, the supernatural mystery, noir, melodrama, and serial killer pop art of the 50s. Interesting perspective there. So it's all over the board, isn't it?
Yes. And this is why it is really one of a kind. The link with silent film with D.W. Griffith is really central to what Lawton wanted to do. He is wanting to take film back to something that it had, in the teens and the 20s that it had lost. And that I think is also something that James Agee is probably bringing to it as a screenwriter, because he also shared this love for silent film. I like that quote from Terrence Rafferty a lot too. I actually just was revisiting that essay. And certainly the humor is very much coming from Mitchum. I mean, Mitchum puts a lot of comedy and even a sort of cartoonishness at times into this performance. And it's remarkable that he can do that and still be really scary at times.
It is quite incredible. You're right about that. The dichotomy between those two tonalities. I would argue that Rachel Cooper is pretty funny in some of her scenes, too.
Miss Boer? Rachel Cooper, get your state troopers out to my place. I got something trapped in my barn.
She really is. Lillian Gish is so wonderful. And of course, needless to say, the connection with D.W. Griffith and silent film is part of why Lawton wanted to cast Lillian Gish.
Yeah.
That role of Rachel Cooper could be so saccharine and cloying,
Right.
and yet to me, Lillian Gish is completely able to pull it off, partly with the humor, that she has this humor, and she has this stillness and simplicity, and you really feel that she is this force, but she's never doing too much, and it's also a performance that thus kind of nicely balances Mitchum's kind of over the top performance. But she is truly wonderful.
And speaking of comic relief, you have to tip your hat as well to Evelyn Varden as Icy Spoon. What an interestingly named character there, but she's so over the top sometimes in her performance and demonstrative affects.
When you've been married to a man 40 years, you know all that don't amount to a hill of beans. I've been married to my Walt that long, and I swear in all that time I just lie there thinking about my canning.
Yeah, I often find myself laughing at what she's doing. And then, of course, the whole kind of turnabout hypocrisy, burn 'em, lynch 'em kind of stuff by the end is quite funny to me. So, yeah, it's a movie that's so hard to categorize. You're absolutely right. Today, maybe adults gravitate more toward it or revisit it more for the humorous aspect. But in any event, it's always interesting to revisit this film, in my opinion, because you pick up something new. So let's transition here. I want to talk a little bit more at length, as I do with every guest every month, about what makes this movie a masterwork. Why is it worthy of celebration 7 decades now later, Imogen? And what ways has it remained evergreen? And why does it still matter?
It's such a fearless film. I mean, because it is taking all of these risks. It is risking sentimentality, it is risking silliness, it is, doing all of these things that could really not work. And of course, we can remember that this film was a terrible flop when it came out.
Oh, yeah.
I suspect that this mix of tones and just how different it was from anything anybody else was doing at the time, audiences just didn't know what to make of it.
Plus, they're denigrating quite a huge swath of their audience, like in the Bible Belt, the South, the rural America, etc.
It is also risky and somewhat, remarkable that they could make a film like this at the time with this character of the preacher, and how you see yes, how everybody falls for him. Almost everybody falls for him. So it is this critique of religious hypocrisy, and the kind of sexual element of his violence is quite disturbing. And so it's daring and brave on a lot of levels.
Absolutely.
But I think what makes it work is, it's a film with such a strong vision that you just feel that Lawton and this entire kind of team that he assembled, and part of why it's such a wonderful movie is who he got, getting agey, the wonderful music by Walter Schumann, Stanley Cortez, his cinematography. He got this team to support this vision he had, but you can constantly feel watching the film that he has this intense vision of what it is he wants, and he's just not afraid to go for it.
It's quite remarkable, the achievement, considering this is the one and only film that Lawton directed, which leads to my major point about what makes this film amazing and why is it worth celebrating. Well, it could be the greatest one-hit wonder by a director in film history. Equivalent in my mind to, let's say, a literary comparison, sole standout novels like Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, for being what? For being exceptionally singular in their creation.
Yes.
It's quite astounding, again, this one-hit wonder aspect of it.
Yes, and it makes it very hard to know what he would have done if he had ever directed another film.
Yeah, and I was watching on Criterion the different supplements. And unfortunately, the financial failure at the box office really crushed his spirit, and he did not want to go back to the director's chair. So it's a shame. It's interesting to think what could have been, right? Because to your point, it's such an exceptional vision. It seems like he absolutely knows what he's doing, Lawton, and of course he's brought all the right collaborators and cast together. So that's half the battle right there, but just his directing choices, which speak so well to his instincts on this film, which seem to be right time after time. You were talking about a moment ago about the vision for the film, and you considered that the sets often look artificial, dreamlike, unrealistic. Imogen, this is a world untethered from any particular time or realistic place, and I think that's what gives the movie more of a timeless look and feel that transcends, 70 years onward. It's a movie that you can't necessarily say looks or feels as old as some of its contemporaries.
Well, I think it is and it isn't. I think it has a timeless aspect in its expressionism and in this sort of fairy tale quality that it has. But I also think that there is an aspect of it that is about capturing this particular moment in time. And it's one way of thinking about that also is that, of course, Lawton is English. Lawton is, so he's making this movie that is pure Americana, and you can see him creating or recreating an America that he has seen in the movies, or that is this sort of vision that he has that is untethered from his own reality. But at the same time, you have, A.G., who grew up in Tennessee, in a small town. You have Mitchum, who, had kind of traveled the roads and the, ridden freight trains during the Depression.
That's right, yeah.
So they're bringing a real lived-in sense of this world. And I think some of the footage, there is this mix of these very stylized, artificial, expressionistic sets at times, and the kind of second unit footage of the towns and the countryside and the river and everything. And so it is actually a film, I think, that balances a sense of realism with this more dreamlike quality. And it is very specific about the fact that this is during the Depression.
Yes. And you're right about that. And to your point, thinking about there are certain shots, maybe lesser so than the dreamlike ones, where you're reminded that, yes, this is hardscrabble life, like the scene where the kids go begging for food at the doorstep of the beleaguered mother, for example. Reminds me of something straight out of John Ford's Grapes of Wrath, which suddenly you're maybe taken out of the fairy tale for a moment and reminded that, yeah, these kids are really hungry.
Right. And you have those aerial shots early in the film, along the roads and of the houses. And so it's another thing that the film does that's sort of risky is you're moving back and forth between a real world and this kind of created, imagined world. But again, to me, I think it works.
Absolutely. I think it still matters too because of its disturbing visual subjectivity, its stylized vantage point. In other words, through the POV of these kids, most of them. Not every shot, but a lot of the shots are, of course, from their vantage point and plays as a kind of Grimm's fairy tale. Cooper is our voiceover narrator, at least from the beginning, but the primary point of view is the kids, and many shots and scenes appear simplistic or exaggerated or distorted, I think because we're meant to see the story through more innocent, inexperienced eyes. If I can quote Lawton here, he had said that it's really a nightmarish sort of Mother Goose tale we are telling. We tried to surround the children with creatures they might have observed and that might have seemed part of a dream. It was, in a way, a dream for them. And that speaks to the artificiality of a lot of what we see here, too. And also the character of Powell. right? Because he can come across as buffoonish and silly and cartoonish and so forth. I think that's, again, part of the filter of who's telling this story. Expertly personified by Mitchum. And again, this remains one of the most frightening and indelible characters in the history of cinema, even if you don't find him as frightening in 2025 as you might have in 1955. But again, he appears intentionally as comically monstrous and absurd, and I think that's consistent with the fact that we are viewing him primarily through the eyes of John and Pearl, who perceive him as a literal monster. And you ruminate, as you mentioned a moment ago, on how upsetting this villain and the film overall would have been to 1950s audiences, especially in its implicit and explicit violence directed at children and at women.
Well, he is very much the big bad wolf.
Yep.
I mean, that is what this role is. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's kind of made explicit in the voiceover at the beginning.
And then the good Lord went on to say, beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves.
There's times where he even acts like a Frankenstein monster, like with the arms extended going up the, cellar stairs,
that
right?
Scene in the cellar is completely Looney Tunes. I mean, it becomes this kind of slapstick.
And there's other times where you hear him yelp or grunt or howl like a wounded animal. A human being in the realistic world probably wouldn't utter those guttural noises in the context that we see, but POV and what's he doing with this performance? Well, continue with your thought, because I think we're on the same train here.
Well, I think what actually makes him scary is how this sense that he is somebody who is insane, obviously, and somebody who is without any human inhibitions. And so those howls and the sort of sounds that he makes, that is what makes him so scary. But I also feel like it's a performance where, as you say, we're seeing him through the eyes of, and when you say the children, I mean, John's perspective and Pearl's perspective are completely different because, Pearl is very much taken in by him and loves him. And she is sort of too young to understand what's really going on. And it's right. John who has the skeptical eye. It's
true.
John's eye through which we see the phoniness and the hypocrisy of his act.
Mm-hmm.
But we also can kind of see him, with the eyes of Willa, perhaps, of what is attractive and charismatic about him. And so the fact that he sort of changes from scene to scene, I mean, obviously has these different personas he puts on for different moments. And we see him also in certain scenes by himself. He is introduced, when he is talking to God as he's driving along the road.
Lord, I am tired. Sometimes I wonder if you really understand. Not that you mind the killings. Your book is full of killings. But there are things you do hate, Lord. Perfume-smelling things, lacy things with curly hair.
So we see him, we see the sort of real person. Mm-hmm. Also, of course, the great scene where you see him, watching the burlesque show.
Yeah,
and
no question about it. Yeah, the inner rage that he expresses, especially in that scene, is palpable.
We see him from all these different perspectives, but there is always this sense of unpredictability of him being somebody, without any kind of limits.
Right. I find the most chilling moment when he's sitting down with the children in the kitchen.
Now, don't touch my knife. That makes me mad. Makes me very, very mad. And just tell me, where's the money hid?
But that's why I promised John I wouldn't tell.
John doesn't matter! Can I get that through your head, you poor, silly, disgusting little wretch?
He makes her cry. Of course, the switchblade is fully popped out, and there's something about that moment, terrifying a little child. It really gets me all the way up the spinal cord. I don't know, that it raises the hackles on the back of my neck.
Yes, but I actually would say, I think possibly the cruelest moment in the film, not a frightening one, but a cruel moment, is the wedding night scene, the scene in which he shames Willa
yes.
for expecting to have a normal wedding night.
You thought, Willa, that the moment you walked in that door, I'd start to paw on you in that abominable way that men are supposed to do on their wedding night.
Look at yourself. What do you see, girl? You see the body of a woman, the temple of creation and motherhood. You see the flesh of Eve that man since Adam has profaned. That body was meant for begetting children. It was not meant for the lust of men.
And that's this turning point for her character where, he breaks her.
In 2025, we are so much more sensitive to gaslighting now, right? And that's something you could see right through.
Yeah, and just the power dynamic between them.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's something wonderful then at the end of the film when he comes face to face with Ms. Cooper is the one time you see this change and he finally meets someone who is actually able to stand up to him and is stronger than he is.
Yeah, excellent examples. Just to finish this thought about what makes the movie so remarkable 70 years later, I think the river journey sequence is kind of the centerpiece here. It's so extraordinary, so exquisite. The imagery, it's dreamlike, it's nightmarish, but it's also, to me, kind of soothing. And you think of the tiny critters that foreground the frame visually. They loom large, but they also seem to be kind of watching them indifferently. Maybe it suggests that nature is a neutral observer in their struggle, or maybe it suggests that these helpless, exposed creatures can relate to the dilemma of the children. But again, the centerpiece of the movie is that sequence. You think of this maybe as a chase movie in some people's minds, but that chase really doesn't happen until after the halfway point, so there's quite a lot that happens before.
Well, absolutely. It's the centerpiece of the movie. And it also is a sequence that's tonally really interesting because there is this sense, they make their escape. And there is kind of this, as you say, this soothing sense in this, the river is sort of taking care of them and that they are safe as long as they are on the river.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, there's this sense of these two small children completely, adrift in the night, in this sort of wilderness, and the wonderful overhead shots of them in the boat where it makes them look so small. And you have the song that Pearl sings, and it has this, ethereal kind of otherworldly quality, that whole sequence. The culminating in this wonderful scene where they go onto land and, first they hear this woman singing a lullaby, and we never see her, we never even see a silhouette or anything, but they stand outside this house and they hear this woman singing a lullaby. And again, it's this sense of, these orphaned children, these children who are on their own.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the scene where they're sleeping in the hayloft and John wakes up and hears the preacher in the distance singing, which is one of the moments that I really remember from the very first time I saw the film, of just how kind of chilling, but chilling in this also very kind of beautiful way. And that's one of the most stylized scenes in the whole film. The houses are, sort of flat, and the light is very strange, but it's almost like we're watching a shadow play at that moment.
Yeah. This is where there's an advantage to having limited resources. So low budget means they had to shoot everything on studio, fabricated studio sets. And here you can get by with very little and make your point in a somewhat expressionistic way, as we were talking about. So a little bit of trivia, the silhouette of him off on the horizon in that particular scene where John wakes up in the barn, that's actually a little person riding a pony. So a little bit of forced perspective, I guess, from a distance.
Yes, I know that, and it's one of those things I kind of wish I didn't know, because now when I see the movie
Exactly.
and I see that scene, you can kind of see it.
You don't want to know how the sausage is made. You just want to enjoy the meal. I get it. Yeah. So it makes sense. One more point about what makes this movie a masterwork or worth celebrating 7 decades onward. I thought about this, and I think it's worthy of celebration because it's a kind of cinematic phoenix that rose from the ashes. It's a reclaimed classic years after being abandoned by audiences. You mentioned so rightly that it was a flop on its original theatrical release. But much like Citizen Kane or It's a Wonderful Life or so many other classics that we ordain as, timeless masterpieces today, this movie was reappraised by critics and scholars decades later. And so I think it's all the more beloved today because, kind of like the orphaned children that Cooper embraces, new generations have adopted it as one of their favorites. Now, we may not even be aware in the background that this was a flop in its time, but thank God it exists, because a lot of these movies, haven't survived the ravages of time or abandonment, if you will.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's talk briefly about Lawton here and some of his filmmaking choices. As fine as an actor as he was, Imogen, did he miss his true calling as a superlative director, considering that, again, this is the only film he helmed?
Well, I don't see why he couldn't have done both. I don't think we would have wanted to be without his performances.
Certainly not.
Either. But But it is a particularly surprising debut because it is very different from many of the films that he was in. As I say, he's drawing on influences that really were not connected with his own career or his own background. The silent films, the German Expressionism, the Americana, and yet he handles it all with so much assurance. And I think that there is something about this film that he was able, because of who he was, to get this extraordinary commitment and investment from the people who were involved in the film. I mean, Mitchum in particular.
Right.
Lawton was among the not, fairly small group of people that Mitchum truly respected and, wanted to do his best for.
Yeah, it's hard to find one person affiliated with the making of the movie that said a bad word about Lawton or, his direction.
Yeah, it's not that it, like any production, didn't have its, difficult aspects, particularly around, the production, but I'm sure you have seen, and many people may have seen, the outtakes of the film, which are now included on the Criterion release.
Yeah, it's a whole separate disc, yeah.
There are these wonderful behind the scenes outtakes. And you can see this as a shoot where, there's this sense of creative rapport among these people. And obviously that was something Lawton was able to bring to this project, and to, I think, his passion for it and his vision. There's a feeling somehow of everybody really, really being intimately involved.
Pulling together and overcoming challenges. And often I heard that he would ask for feedback and apologize to, did I do it the wrong way, kind of a thing. And everybody assured him that he was doing just fine. But you look at the work itself and some of the choices and shots and edit points, etc. You talked about the memorable overhead aerial shots, I think often done by helicopter. There's quite a few of them. There's also interesting directionality, Imogen, in the narrative by having the children move from left to right during the river escape. It's pretty consistent with the directionality. But then suddenly it shifts from right to left once they encounter Cooper, and I don't know, maybe there's a thematic suggestion that you have to face your fears, break from old habits, go the other direction, and not be afraid. I don't know. Maybe that's reading too tightly into it. But it's interesting, the left to right and then right to left kind of choices. And curiously, the scene that introduces Cooper, you remember this? It's composed of 3 successive shots where the characters move left, but the camera remains static instead of doing the usual, which is panning or tracking the camera along their route. I found that really an interesting choice. Maybe something that harkens back to old-timey movies, some Griffith's age, I don't know, but it just stood out to me.
Well, he also frequently frames her looking directly at the camera and kind of directly in the middle of the shot,
right?
Which I think certainly gives her a stature that's different from anybody else in the film, and is, I think, harking back to the sort of framing of very early films. But yeah, it's stylistically does a lot of different things as well, as I think we've already touched on. I mean, it has a lot of, the shot where the children go into the barn and it's all shot through the legs of the cows. Yeah.
Who knows, Imogen, maybe that shot influenced The Graduate years later.
Who knows? There are these sort of strange, interesting shots. I mean, I think it's a quality that we sometimes associate with first films. But that sense of, people sort of not knowing what they're not supposed to do is something that makes a lot of first films exciting.
Right. He's opting for storybook fantasy and exaggeration often in this movie over realism. There are absolutely moments of realism. We've established that. But cases in point here, there's no practical way that Powell puts Willa's body in the car into the middle of the river. How the hell would he have accomplished that? You talked about Pearl's singing of the haunting folk song. I think it's called Pretty Fly. It's obviously voiced by a skilled adult singer. Like, anybody can read through that. Powell's many hyperbolic gestures and over-the-top sermonizing, they ooze artificiality. So he isn't afraid to, go for the fairy tale storybook exaggerated approach here, and more power to him for that. It's not like this has to be rooted from start to finish in practical reality. And he also turns lemons into lemonade, as I mentioned, by, even though he's restricted by a low budget, he shoots primarily on sound stages at Samuel Goldwyn Studios in Hollywood. So he's got this controlled environment, utilizing painted backdrops and stylized lighting and expressionist set designs. And he isn't afraid to go for the lo-fi here.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the shot of Willa at the bottom of the river because that, of course, is one of the
What a
most
shot.
memorable and most often referenced shots in this movie. And it's a perfect example of this, something that is both beautiful and horrifying. You know, it is
Yes.
this horrifying image that is also really presented in this eerie, ethereal way. And it's, of course, interesting that the only person who actually sees that is the character of Uncle Bertie,
Hmm.
James Gleason's character, who is the one who witnesses this and then is completely traumatized by it. But yes, obviously the art, the kind of this artificiality is, I think, another of the things that it's very out of time for that moment. I mean, in the mid 50s,
Hmm.
unless you're talking about a musical, unless it's like a Gene Kelly musical or something. Movies ever since World War II had been moving more and more in the direction of realism,
Hmm.
and location shooting and this more natural acting style. And that was kind of,
Although there was still noir, right? And noir was pretty expressive and
but even
stylized.
if you look at film noir, there is a definite arc in film noir where
Hmm.
the films of the 40s tend to be more stylized, more likely to be shot on sets and sound stages. They have
True.
more of the kind of extreme expressionistic lighting. I mean, there are some exceptions, like Touch of Evil or something,
Hmm.
that are still quite stylized, but you start to see in the post-war years this kind of documentary style realism that comes in. And so Lawton just, completely going against the grain in that way and harking back to this much older style, is another part of what's both daring and wonderful about the film, but also probably why people at the time just didn't know what to make of it.
Right. Again, good choices, good instincts. We definitely need to talk, as we do every month, about influences, innovations, inspirations. You think that maybe this is the first Southern Gothic horror movie, a subgenre of Gothic fiction set in the American South. Southern Gothic uses decaying settings and grotesque characters to explore madness and violence and the dark undercurrents of society in the South, particular, including religious fanaticism, racism, moral hypocrisy. Notable authors in this tradition include Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, Tennessee Williams, Carson McCullers, Harper Lee, Eudora Welty. There's many in that tradition. But some other Southern Gothic-tinged fright films and thrillers that arguably came after Night of the Hunter: Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte from 1964, Spider Baby a few years later. There's Let's Scare Jessica to Death, The Beguiled, The Evictors, Angel Heart, Skeleton Key. Some of these are kind of on the periphery, but again, I think there's a tradition established here a little bit in terms of a Southern Gothic horror movie.
Yes, and because you were talking about writers, it just, I realize I don't think we've named the author of the source novel, but we should mention Davis Grubb, who is, not a well-known author.
Mm-hmm.
This is certainly the only book of his that I've read, the only one that I know of. He was a native of West Virginia, but this was in fact based on a novel that is very much from that tradition. I mean, obviously we would already had Streetcar Named Desire, being filmed a few years before this.
Yep.
And Tennessee Williams is starting to sort of introduce this. But yes, I think, and it's also something you see, there's a certain number of noir films that have a kind of Southern Gothic quality to them. Moonrise, for instance, which is 1948, I think, Frank Borzegui's film, which I was actually thinking about when I rewatched the film, because the scene where the children taunt John and Pearl, with this song about, their father being hanged, reminds me of Moonrise. And, it opening with this child who is scarred, sort of psychologically scarred by his father having been hanged. So it's not the first movie to use this kind of atmosphere and setting, but certainly I think you're absolutely right that it is something that became much more common
Yes.
in the years that followed.
But it's also unique and innovative in its experimental tonality. Let's put it that way. As we said, it blends different genres and subgenres. Horror, crime pictures, Mother Goose fairy tale sensibilities, small town Americana imagery, sentimental humanism, almost Capra-esque. I think of the Christmas time conclusion in particular, and even the opening, which kind of reminds you of something like It's a Wonderful Life, with bodies up in the heavens and so forth talking to us. Looney Tunes style cartoonish comedy, as we talked about in terms of the Big Bad Wolf approach. The dreamlike, fantastical narrative style of maybe Jean Cocteau, his film Beauty and the Beast from 1946. There's even a likely unintentional nod, as I said, to Grapes of Wrath in that hardscrabble scene that I mentioned. So it's not being wall-to-wall scary, suspenseful, dark, or downbeat. I think it's perhaps a stretch to classify this as an outright horror picture. Lawton biographer Simon Callow said that he didn't personally find Night of the Hunter frightening, nor did he believe the director intended this film to be frightening. But in the wake of Night of the Hunter, what are some films that might have drawn some inspiration? Cape Fear is an obvious one that comes to mind, both the original from 1962 and the remake. Other movies inspired by the plot or characters or unique visual style, perhaps Elmer Gantry comes to mind, or Whistle Down the Wind, or, of course, To Kill a Mockingbird in some ways. The violent attitude toward female sexuality in young children, that certainly would have been controversial in the mid-1950s. Who did it influence? Well, maybe David Lynch or Guillermo del Toro or Terrence Malick, because I think of the unsettling contrast between youthful purity and the sinister, often predatory forces of the adult world in del Toro's Devil's Backbone, or, of course, Pan's Labyrinth. I think of Malick's Badlands and Days of Heaven, which both reflect Lawton's lyrical, mythic approach to storytelling, as well as the apathy of nature to human struggles. And then Lynch's fascination with blending idyllic American imagery and surreal menace. I think it owes a lot to this picture. The evidence is clear on something like Blue Velvet and Twin Peaks. Of course, Martin Scorsese has long credited this movie for influencing a lot of works, not just Cape Fear, but Shutter Island. Rainer Werner Fassbinder, Robert Altman, there's some overtures there about how this film helped color or influence their works like Ali Fear Eats the Soul, Nashville. The Coen brothers have acknowledged that this movie is a key influence on their work. You think of the mythic storytelling tone that resonates through like Raising Arizona or No Country for Old Men. There's even a similar corpse found on the river's bottom in their film The Man Who Wasn't There. Of course, we're immediately reminded of Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing with the love and hate monologue throughout the character of Radio Raheem and on his knuckles. So yeah, are there any that come to mind after Night of the Hunter that you wanted to cite?
I think that was fairly comprehensive, but it also is a film that has obviously been a big influence. And, probably partly also just an influence on filmmakers as an example of the possibility of doing something so idiosyncratic and so visionary. I know that Guillermo del Toro has cited this as an influence on his work. But at the same time, there is still nothing else that is quite like this.
No.
Because its particular flavor and its particular combination of elements is so distinctive. And there is a kind of innocence that is captured in the film. For all it also has these very dark and unsettling elements. Mm-hmm. The innocence in it feels very real. And that is something that is perhaps the hardest thing to really capture, is that sense of the children's innocence of a world in which kind of innocence and these very dark forces coexist.
Right.
I mean, you mentioned the Christmas scene at the end being very kind of Capra-esque, and it literally intersects with this lynch mob.
Yep.
There's a scene where Miss Cooper and her children are walking down the street and they're kind of hurrying along because this mob of people with torches and whatnot are on their way to the jail to lynch Harry Powell. So the way that those things coexist is so unusual. Mm-hmm. And so yes, it's certainly an influential film, and it's a film that I think can never really be imitated. There's nothing else that has ever been quite like it.
Absolutely. Well said. I totally agree. I mean, how can you think about remaking this film? Or if it had never been made, how do you make this story come to life today? We're in a postmodern age of irony where it's hard to reflect true sincerity on the screen. Everybody's so cynical and jaded. It's kind of what we've been given as far as programmed content for so long that it's refreshing to me to go back to these older pictures and feel the true innocence in characters like that. Certain filmmakers have the knack for pulling that off, but it would be difficult. No question. I agree.
Yes, and it is a reason why this film is sometimes discussed in the context of film noir, but I don't really see this.
Well, maybe just the chiaroscuro lighting design.
Yes, although, the chiaroscuro lighting it's coming from the same root as, that influenced film noir. It's coming from German Expressionism.
Horror movies too, yeah.
But there is something about that innocence and the way that we finally see that innocence being sort of triumphant in the film,
right,
that is fundamentally different from film noir. Needless to say, I love film noir, but this to me is capturing something that's quite different.
Yeah, we are in simpatico there. So we have to talk a bit about themes. What is this movie trying to tell us, Imogen? If I could kick things off here, I think the obvious main takeaway, maybe right off the top, is this is a timeless struggle between two opposing forces, is it not? What are the two opposing forces? Well, good and evil, of course, but also love and hate, innocence and corruption, children versus adults, paternal authoritarianism versus, I guess, maternal compassion. This movie is about light and shadow. Those are the words of cinematographer Stanley Cortez in one of the supplements on the disc, which I thought was really well articulated. Cooper and Powell, the preacher and the mother goose, they stand on opposite sides of the spectrum in the battle for the lives and souls of the two children. Powell's story of the right hand versus left hand kind of reinforces this thematic fight, right?
Would you like me to tell you the little story of right hand, left hand? The story of good and evil? H-A-T-E. It was with this left hand that old Brother Cain struck the blow that laid his brother low. L-O-V-E. You see these fingers, dear hearts? These fingers has veins that run straight to the soul of man. The right hand, friends, the hand of love. Now watch and I'll show you the story of life. These fingers, dear hearts, is always a warring and a tugging, one against the other.
But remember that he wields a switchblade, Imogen. She wields a shotgun. So you bring a literal and metaphorical knife to a gunfight and you are destined to lose.
Well, what's interesting about the film is that it tells us what its themes are in so many words. And the first, of course, is beware of false prophets.
Yes, right up
Those
front.
are the words with which the film opens. And I would say that is still a very powerful and relevant subject. The degree to which many people are, in fact, vulnerable to seeing wolves in sheep's clothing and seeing what they want to see.
Right. So relevant today.
Still very particularly relevant today,
Oh, yeah.
I would say. And then seeing, as you say, the sort of the hypocrisy of their turnaround at the end. When they learn the truth, they do not see themselves as in any way responsible, or they don't seem to recognize, they don't seem to think about their own, how they've been taken in. They simply blame the person who deceived them.
Yep, they just go straight into angry mob mode.
So that's the, one message. But the other, of course, is, and also spoken by Miss Cooper.
It's a hard world for little things.
Yes.
I mean, that is, I think, the great line in the movie. And that sense of the world as a place in which the small, the vulnerable, the less powerful are always going to be preyed upon by these more powerful forces. This is why you have Harry Powell as this big bad wolf character. I mean, and that is part of the fairy tale aspect, but also with this idea of the children ultimately having this power to endure.
Yeah, the resilience of children.
The resilience of children, the power of innocence.
Yeah, because while she says it's a hard world for little things, maybe the big quote of the movie, she also says, when you're little, you have more endurance than God is ever to grant you again. Children are man at his strongest.
They abide and they endure.
This speaks to both aspects of the fragility as well as the sturdiness of kids. And you pondered the many examples of absentee or neglectful parenting in this story as embodied in the clueless Willa, who puts her husband ahead of her offspring. You think of the prison hangman father who comes home too late to tuck in his children and he feels guilty about that. Even Icy Spoon, who, what does she do? She enables and defends Powell to the detriment of Pearl and John. And ironically, Imogen, the responsible adult figures, Cooper and Uncle Bertie, they're two seniors with no biological children of their own to care for, but who serve as surrogate moms and dads to John and Pearl. And Cooper regards herself as,
I'm a strong tree with branches for many birds. I'm good for something in this old world, and I know it, too.
So, yeah, there's a lot of good and bad examples of parental figures. But also, the movie is certainly about the dangers of overzealous religious fundamentalism, sanctimonious Bible thumpers. I think that kind of goes without saying. But I kind of read this time around, I was reading, not to get didactic about it, I'm not a religious person, but Old Testament versus New Testament. And you consider the many spiritual and personality contrasts between Powell and Cooper. His twisted brand of faith embraces fundamentalist old-time religion, and the kind in which a wrathful God sits in judgment and sinners must be immediately punished. Cooper, on the other hand, she invokes the name of Jesus, tellingly, when she sings the lyrics to Leaning on the Everlasting Arms, and she demonstrates a much more compassionate and forgiving piety. There's so many different themes here. Unhealthy, repressed, warped sexuality, female subservience. So revealing what Mrs. Spoon says about marital sex.
I just lie there thinking about my canning.
Yeah. It's all a pipe dream. And then Willa's saying,
Help me to get clean so I can be what Harry wants me to be.
It makes you groan. But this movie's also about man's animalistic nature, right? I mean, Powell, we said he often behaves like a predatory, violent animal. He's scared off with the shotgun. And then Cooper says, she calls the state troopers and says, I got something trapped in my barn, almost as if Powell is this cornered and wounded coyote. It's kind of a redemption story, too, in the sense of maybe through Ruby's eyes, because Ruby, the older orphan under Cooper's watch, she's morally restored by the end of the film because earlier she's tempted by teenage boys and even the sweet talk of this slick preacher, susceptible to sexual opportunists and even pregnancy, right? But by the end, she shifts from this endangered sheep to a loyal member of the flock. It's a smaller sub-theme maybe, but this is a redemption story in some ways.
Well, and it's also very much about John.
Oh, yeah.
That John is this child who has been given this responsibility that is clearly too much for him to bear. He's been given this responsibility for his younger sister and for guarding this money. He's the one who is in this transitional moment between being a child and being an adult. And there's so many shots of just his gaze and the way he is watching everything. And he, unlike Pearl, kind of understands what's going on, but also doesn't really understand what's going on. He's very wounded, and he does sort of finally break down at the end. And really interestingly, it's this moment when he sees Harry Powell being arrested, and he sort of flashes back. It's so similar to him seeing his father being arrested.
Triggering that trauma, right, yeah.
And then in the courtroom, he refuses to identify Powell. And so there's something about his trauma, but also at the very end, you feel that he is going to be healed by this loving home that Miss Cooper has created.
It's a very moving wrap-up, yes.
I think it is about this idea of resilience, and there are all these people like Willa, who do not make it out of the movie, who don't have that opportunity.
True.
There's good and evil, but there's also, as you say, with Ruby and with John, the sense of people who are still kind of able to change and to heal.
Yeah, so well put. Now it's the 70th birthday of Night of the Hunter. Birthdays are about giving presents, I say, but it's the fans who continue to receive the gifts. So, Imogen, what is Night of the Hunter's greatest gift to viewers?
I think we've already touched on a lot of them. I think it's just the experience of watching it and the way that, for me, I've seen it many, many times, and yet watching it again, it has this spellbinding quality and this kind of enchantment about it that is really enduring, and I can still experience it with that same kind of frisson that I had the first time that I saw it, and that's a remarkable thing for a film.
Yeah, no, that's good to know. Absolutely. It's not like it becomes a rote exercise of nostalgia. It's something that you can watch with fresh eyes in some ways every revisit. I can relate. I agree with that. My take, I feel that Night of the Hunter's greatest benefaction to audiences, Imogen, is the abundance of unforgettable images carefully crafted by Charles Laughton and his ace cinematographer, Stanley Cortez. Many of these visuals reveal the heavy influence of, as we said, German expressionism, noir, horror, and that's evidenced by the chiaroscuro lighting scheme we talked about, the sharp architectural angles, the minimalist set designs. I was reading that Cortez even uses a single candle as a source of light to maximize stylistic effect in some of the shots, so quite astounding. Stunning visual highlights include the opening sequence where the face of Cooper and her surrogate children appear in the heavens, the foreshadowing image of the thundering locomotive. You think of the bedroom scene, of course, of Willa's murder with its stylistic knife-sharp shadows making the room appear like an unholy chapel. There's the episode in the charcoal black cellar with its sharp diagonal staircase. The exaggerated shadows that Powell casts across walls, of course, the high contrast silhouette shots of the preacher on horseback, the hauntingly beautiful underwater visions of Willa's throat-slit corpse, the fantastical river journey the children take by John boat, the scene where the kids are fast asleep and the camera tilts up to the heavens, revealing the artificially glittery stars that dissolve into the morning sun. And, yeah, the shadowy singing showdown sequence pitting Cooper against Powell. One after another, the visuals are showstoppers. What's Imogen Sarah Smith up to lately? Are there any current or forthcoming projects, maybe events or appearances or otherwise, that our listeners should know about?
Well, I can mention a few things. Coming up in June, for anyone who is out in the Bay Area, the Pacific Film Archive is doing a series of screenings of noir films that's sort of inspired by this book I wrote called In Lonely Places, Film Noir Beyond the City.
Mm-hmm.
I will be there for the opening weekend, June 6th through 8th, introducing a few films. So there's that. I also have a film series that I helped guest curate that's on the Criterion Channel going up on May 1st.
Oh, cool.
And it is about film noir and the blacklist.
Interesting. Okay.
So something that when I proposed it a long time ago seemed like a historical exercise and now feels a lot more timely and relevant than I'd like it to.
Yeah, right.
But there is some really interesting, lesser known, less commonly screened films in that. These are, by people like Cy Enfield, Joseph Losey, Jules Dassin, John Barry, also, works by blacklisted screenwriters. So there's that. And then I can just mention the fact that I also do teach online classes, which are open to anyone with an internet connection. I teach fairly regularly through the 92nd Street Wise Roundtable program.
Okay.
I'm currently sort of finishing up a class right now, but I do have another that will be coming up later this summer, if people want to keep an eye out.
Now, how can people find out about that class or sign up?
They would go to the website of the 92nd Street Y Roundtable.
Okay.
And it's their online learning program. I'm also teaching through another purely online platform called Cine Journeys. I will be teaching a class about Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger.
Oh, great.
That starts May 13th, I think. It's mid-May.
Okay.
It's 5 weeks. People can still register for that, and that would go to the Cine Journeys website to find that.
Fantastic. Wow, you got a lot on your platter there. Anything else you want to mention?
I do have another book project, but it's in the very early stages, and I'm not ready to share it yet.
Little early. Got it. Well, Imogen, it was wonderful going 9 full innings with you on this home run of a movie. I really appreciate your time, your expertise, and your opinions. Thanks so much for appearing on Cineversary.
Thank you, Eric. It was a pleasure.
Fantastic conversation there with Miss Smith, who never fails to impress with her encyclopedic film knowledge and valued opinions. That was a lot of fun, Imogen, and much appreciated. Thank you. Time now for standing ovations. This is where I give a shout out to a film, website, book, TV program, podcast, or any other work that I'm convinced would be of interest to classic film lovers just like you and me. Let's give a round of applause this month to a new book. It's TCM Imports by Turner Classic Movies host Alicia Malone, who actually appeared on our show a few years back to celebrate with me the 70th anniversary of Singin' in the Rain. If you've ever wanted to broaden your cinematic horizons beyond Hollywood, TCM Imports is your perfect companion. This new book celebrates the richness of international cinema in an inviting, approachable way. Whether you're a lifelong cinephile or someone just starting to dip a toe into the world of foreign films, Malone's selections open a gateway to stories, to styles, and to cultures from every corner of the globe. From celebrated masterpieces to overlooked gems, the collection spans decades of filmmaking and captures the spirit of international artistry in all its forms. Now, instead of a standard chronological or regional arrangement, the films in this book are grouped by seasons and moods, offering readers a playful, intuitive way to plan their viewing. Each entry features a movie quote, a to watch when suggestion, and a lively commentary packed with behind-the-scenes stories, cultural context, and striking photographs in both color and black and white. It's Malone's voice, however, that shines through the most, with an enthusiasm that's infectious, making even the most obscure or unconventional titles here feel accessible and intriguing. So what are the films included in the book, you're asking? Amelie, Ikaru, Lady Snowblood, The Girls, In the Mood for Love, Ali, Fear Eats the Soul, Bicycle Thieves, Daisies, Spring in a Small Town, Late Spring, The Passion of Joan of Arc, Black Girl, Purple Noon, Cleo from 5 to 7, Parasite, La Ventura, Metropolis, The Rules of the Game, Fanny and Alexander, Black Christmas, and My Night at Maud's are among the selections. The paperback version of TCM Imports, it can be had wherever you buy books for $28. Did you know that Cineversary has its own website? That's right, we actually now have a vanity URL that's easy to remember, which will take you to a freshly designed portal where you can quickly access the latest episode of your favorite podcast, as well as all of our previous installments. Now it's a lot easier to spread the good word about our show to your friends and family. You simply tell them to visit Cineversary.com. Pretty simple, right? That's Cineversary.com. We also have a custom email address just for you. Now, if you ever want to share feedback on our show or offer suggestions for future installments, or maybe you just have a question about Cineversary, send it to us at cineversarypodcast@gmail.com. Also, you can really help our show grow by spreading the good word about the Cineversary show to your peeps. Even better, please leave a positive online review and rating, which significantly helps us to get discovered by new listeners. So if you use Apple Podcasts, Spotify, CastBox, some of these other services, simply search for the Cineversary page, look for a link that says something like ratings or reviews, click that link, and leave a review and or rating. While you're at it, take a moment to like us on Facebook. We also have a presence on Twitter. Our handle is @CineversaryPod, where you can easily tweet or follow us. And if you want to go an extra step in your support of our show and help keep us ad-free, please consider making a monetary donation to the Cineversary podcast by visiting tinyurl.com/donate-cineversary. We really appreciate your support. Lastly, have you checked out my Cineverse Group website? Yeah, it's easy to get confused by these similar sounding names, Cineversary, Cineverse, Tomato. But Cineverse is actually the name of my private film discussion group I founded back in 2005 that continues to meet weekly on Zoom. Every week, the Cineverse group watches, researches, and discusses a different movie, and I create a summary write-up, call it a mini essay if you will, on that movie that gets posted to the Cineverse group blog. So if you want to enjoy reading in-depth content that examines different discussion-worthy motion pictures, including classic Hollywood films, independent features, foreign masterworks, modern movies, and silent era standouts, then visit cineversegroup.com, simply spelled CINEVERSE group.com. Fun fact, every posted article on cineversegroup.com includes a link to a recording of our group discussion of that particular film, with me leading the conversation as moderator. So if you like what I'm doing on the Cineversary podcast, you might also want to give a listen to some of our Cineverse group recordings, which are podcasts of a different sort. Again, head over to cineversegroup.com, where you can check out some interesting text and audio content on a variety of films, not necessarily celebrating a milestone anniversary. What's the perfect summertime movie? The answer may also be the perfect horror film, the motion picture that made all of us afraid to go in the water. Next month, we'll be celebrating the golden anniversary of a movie that represented a sea change in cinema, Steven Spielberg's Jaws, originally released 50 years ago this June. Until then, I remain your humble host, Eric Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, and cherish those classic movies. They're not getting older. Of course, they're getting better. Thanks as ever for giving us a listen.